Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Markus Hofmeyr. Markus grew up in South Africa around wildlife. He started his career as a wildlife veterinarian, and at Madikwe Game Reserve, he was responsible for the oversight and management of the largest wild mammal translocation to date, called Operation Phoenix. Markus was the general manager of the Veterinary Wildlife Services at SANParks, was the chief conservation officer at Great Plains Conservation Foundation and Rhinos Without Borders, and is now the program officer at Oak Foundation and the director of Rhino Recovery Fund. In this conversation, we talk about the current state of rhino populations around the world and the poaching crisis. We dive into Markus's early beginnings in conservation and his in-depth knowledge of wildlife translocation. We go deep into what it's going to take to save the Sumatran rhinos, and he gives us thoughts and advice on working in conservation. If you love rhinos, this is the episode for you. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Markus. Hi, Markus. Appreciate you joining us on the Rhino Man podcast, and it's an honor to be speaking with you.
No, thanks very much for your time, and look forward to sharing some rhino facts with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we could start with your best kind of calculation of how last year went, 2022, in terms of the poaching crisis. And I remember I kind of haven't paid attention to the news as much in the last few months, but I know the first half of the year, people were pretty worried that the poaching was on the rise and the numbers were spiking, and there were quite a few mass poachings in different parts of Africa or South Africa. So I don't know if, based on your knowledge and experience, how have things been towards the second half of that year and how are they shaping up?
Yeah, so this is the dilemma that you sit with in the rhino world, is that things are relatively better than they were in the 70s and then compared to the 70s, 80s and 90s, when there was literally like uncontrolled poaching and the populations crashed pretty much everywhere where they occurred, both in Asia and in Africa. And then there was a sort of a bit of a stall and then real concerted efforts to try and recover rhinos, both in India and in many African countries. Doesn't mean that rhinos still went extinct in the interim. There were other countries, particularly West and Central Africa, that lost all their rhinos after the 90s. But the sort of year of 2022, I can say, was not a bad one for the African black rhino and the greater one-horned rhino of Nepal and India. Unfortunately, the situation for the Sumatran rhino remains critically precarious. I did go to Indonesia at the end of last year and went and shared my experience with our Indonesian colleagues about capture, and that there is unfortunately only one population left that's potentially viable, and that's in the Loisa system in northern Indonesia near Aceh. And then there's obviously, which I haven't visited, and that's my next travel intention in 2023 when I go to Asia, is to visit the last remaining Javan rhino population in Ujung Kulon National Park. Again, very precarious because you're only sitting with one population in one locality, and that locality has some geological risks. It's on the rim of fire, so volcanoes and earthquakes can affect that area, and it's also on a peninsula, so there's very limited space for expansion. The white rhino had a better year in 2022 than it did in 2021. So they're still the species that are losing numerically the most rhinos, and that's because they are the most common rhinos out there. There's roughly about 15,000 of them left. They did go up close to 20,000 before the big poaching onslaught started. And the areas where they're still heavily poached are in South Africa, in the Kruger National Park, and then unfortunately in the park where they were originally saved, at least the southern white rhino, Umfolozi Shishlui in the province of KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, on the eastern side of South Africa. That was the park that lost the most rhinos proportionally to the population in the whole world. So they probably lost almost 10% of their rhino population in 1 year. So I think there's a couple of factors that need to be taken into consideration, is that in most range states, there have been some reintroductions as well. There's a fairly significant political will not to allow poaching to get out of hand. That is not the case necessarily in South Africa. I think that has to improve, but there's also signs that there is more effective law enforcement. And then a big event that took place in 2022 to slow the decline of white rhinos down was that the Kruger National Park dehorned most of their rhinos and also managed to arrest a couple of staff members that were integrally involved with the information leaking towards the poaching syndicates. Because up until 2021, the Kruger National Park was the main reason why there was such a drastic decline in rhinos all over the world, because they were losing hundreds of rhinos a year. They were also the success story of the recovery of rhinos in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They went extinct there in the early 1900s or even the late 1800s. And then between 1970 and early 1990s, about 350 white rhinos were reintroduced from Umfolozi Shishlui to the Kruger National Park. And by the time the poaching had started again in 2007, they'd grown to roughly about 8,000 rhinos, which is a remarkable recovery from that small amount of reintroductions. Unfortunately, since 2007, roughly about that number of rhinos have been shot. You have to understand there's recruitment, so that, you're losing rhinos, but you're also getting rhinos born. And from the figures that haven't been released this year yet, there could be as few as 1,800 rhinos left in the Kruger National Park, white rhinos now. So it's both a success story and an absolute disaster from how you can spend so much money and have such good conservation practices and still lose so many rhinos. And this all comes down to the very basic fact that rhino all over the world are actually an example of a highly evolved, very successful mammal species. They've been around for millions of years, and they haven't really changed much in the last 2 or 3 million years. So that means that they didn't need to evolve for whatever reason beyond that, because if you take humans out of the picture, rhinos have got a few things that kill them. Calves do get caught by the odd predator. They are vulnerable to disease at times. They are vulnerable to stochastic events like flooding and fire and earthquakes. But the most common reason why rhinos die, believe it or not, as adults, is that other rhinos kill them. Now, that's a fantastic success story, because as an adult rhino, you hardly have any predators that are dangerous to you. You're very well adapted to your habitat. You breed very easily. So if we can reinstate that sort of scenario for them, they will very quickly recover, at least those rhino species where you still have a fair amount of rhinos left over. So we as people have been the main reason why they've disappeared in the last decade. We've basically made this highly successful mammal go extinct, like so many other species on this planet. And again, from a conservation perspective, rhinos are a very good proxy for success of conservation. So if you can get to a point where you protect rhinos from humans that want to kill them for their horns, you know that other species are also benefiting from that same protection. Because only by deciding ourselves as people to protect rhinos are we going to save them from going extinct. And this is where the rhino sort of story is really complex. And coming back to the year of 2022, I think we've made some real good progress in some areas, collectively as conservationists and as concerned citizens. But we still have some big leaps to get beyond. I don't think the syndicates that are killing rhinos for their horn have been disrupted enough. I don't think there's been enough change behavior in the demand side of things, which is very difficult because it's very difficult to understand. And then we've got particularly 2 species of rhinos that are so isolated and so reduced to such a small number that they are very precariously close to being technically extinct. And that's going to take a bit more effort to recover them from that. But I have hope for rhinos going forward, at least the species that are still numerically in good shape. And I do think as a success story for conservation, we all need to work to this point where we can have rhinos that have safe habitats so they can do what they do best. That's have an ecological role, breed and propagate. And they actually do that very well with the right circumstances, like we've seen with the recovery in those places where it's happened.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a really great summary. And I definitely want to dive into Sumatran and Javan rhinos a bit as we go. But coming back to the southern white rhinos, can you give us a little bit of the history of, when we almost lost them back in the, was it 60s, 70s, before was it Dr. Ian Player and his team kind of helped bring that group back and start translocating them. But can you give us a little bit of that history and how close were they to extinction? Do you know the numbers, or was there good data on that?
Yeah, so the data on the exact numbers that were left is very sketchy because it was actually in the late 1800s where the last few remaining rhinos. We estimate between 20 and 50 individuals survived. And ironically, they survived in a hunting area of the traditional owners of the land, the Zulus. That was a sacred hunting ground, and then it was actually declared a reserve, an official reserve in the colonial times. So it's again a story of what we really need to acknowledge, that you do need to have areas that are protected not only by laws and by rangers, but also that there's an acceptance that we need areas that are wild. And historically, there were, in fact, those areas that communities and kings and tribes used to have in their areas. So this is a very fantastic story, is that those rhinos survived in this traditional hunting area of the Zulu kingdom, was then made a game reserve, and then with very good conservation and good law enforcement and good conservation practice, they slowly grew to a number beyond, I think it was beyond 400 in the early 60s, where they then started experimenting with translocating, initially with very crude methods like lassoing them or forcing them into capture with ropes, and then starting to use the drugs that are now commonly used in capture, the opioids, other types of drugs. And it was rangers that tried it, not veterinarians. At that time, there were very few veterinarians that were involved. And then the story of translocating them started happening. They started moving them to other reserves. A lot went to the Kruger National Park, which I explained earlier on in what we spoke about, and to other private areas as well. And then I think it was in the 70s that rhinos then were made available to the public in South Africa. And South Africa is a bit of an exception in the African continent. It's South Africa and Namibia that have that land use, is that people can own their land, and you can buy game and actually own the game that you put onto your land. So people then had an incentive to buy this rare species and put it on their land and breed it. And the initial use was tourism, yes, and some form of prestige of owning that. But there was also then the permission to start hunting them in the late 70s. It was then put onto CITES 2, and people could then commercially hunt them, and with very strict quotas. And that really then allowed the takeoff of rhino recovery in South Africa, because then there was a genuine economic benefit with owning rhinos. You could hunt them, and most properties were responsible in that only hunted older males, but it was enough of a value to have an incentive to breed more rhinos and sell more rhinos. And by the time the poaching took off, hunting was a well-established industry together with tourism, and that drove the private sector recovery. And today, as we speak, there are more white rhino in private ownership than there are in state ownership in South Africa. It's because they are incentivized to look after them. They have their own funds. They don't get any help from the state, and are more adaptive and flexible than state organs are, facing this incredible, very criminalized sort of approach to using a natural resource for selfish beneficiation. So that was the big story of the white rhino recovery. There have been also some unfortunate failures, like some rhinos were taken to Mozambique and also to Botswana and Kenya, which was a success story, but Mozambique and Botswana lost all of those rhinos again because they didn't protect them adequately, and there was reasons for that. Kenya took the southern white rhino and actually made a very big success story. There's about almost 1,000 white rhinos now in Kenya. And the same with Namibia. Namibia has also properly recovered white rhinos as a species in their country. Debate that's going on now is, do you take southern rhinos and put them into northern white rhino range? So they two species, considered two species, but genetically they're not very far apart. They were geologically separated at some point, maybe 200,000 years ago, due to probably some climatic event or change in the climate. But, phenotypically they look the same, and they have very similar behavior from what we can deduct from the little bit of information we have from the northern white rhino records, who were actually, by the way, fairly common and much more common than the southern white rhino in the 1800s and early 1900s, because they were distributed throughout the Sahel region of northern Africa. They unfortunately suffered severe poaching then in the 80s and 90s, and now there's two females left in Kenya, and technically they are extinct, because the females are not breeding, and they have recovered some ova, and they're trying artificial insemination and embryo transfer. If that's going to work or not, we don't know, but I think we can accept that basically there's good chances that it's not recoverable.
Yeah. I mean, even if they bring them back, they would probably have to be bred with southern white rhinos or some kind of hybrid.
Exactly, yeah. So the logical step is to take the most closest related species and bring them back, which has now started happening. Kenya has already done that. Rwanda just recently reintroduced white rhino. They want to put rhinos back into Garamba, where the last northern white rhinos in the wild were recorded. And I assume that in time, other African countries will also accept them. And I think it's a very positive step. I don't think we should be splitting hairs at this point because, there isn't really any hairs to split anymore. It's rather saying, how do we actually make sure that rhinos can go back into the areas where they used to occur and have them play the ecological role. And having this ecosystem service recovery alongside providing safe habitat, because if you can do that for the rhinos, we know that other species are also going to benefit hugely from that. A very big success story. It is one of the most successful recoveries of an endangered species that almost went extinct, but is also now the victim of its own success, and that's why they are the most poached rhinos that are currently being killed by illegal traffickers in the globe.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Mozambique. They were poached out there, but recently there's been some translocations, right? Some efforts to bring them back again.
Correct. So Mozambique has had a natural reintroduction of rhinos through rhinos leaving Kruger and moving into areas that are now either national park or publicly protected areas, and then private reserves that are leasing the land from the government of Mozambique and actually running them as hunting or tourism operators. And rhinos have populated those areas. We support, through the Rhino Recovery Fund, a group called the Mozambique Wildlife Alliance, who have been instrumental at ensuring that these rhinos remain safe. So when a rhino wanders into Mozambique and it's got a horn on, they immediately go and dehorn it. And there's probably a small population that's now established there, and you can basically say a natural repopulation of rhinos have occurred from the Kruger National Park. And then there was a once-off reintroduction into Zinav National Park, which is just to the east of Gonorrhoeau National Park in Zimbabwe. That was done by the Peace Parks Foundation. They put in, I think it was 19 white rhinos into that park. They're not in the whole park, they're just in a sanctuary. And then there are plans at foot to put rhinos in the future in Maputo National Park and into Gorongosa National Park. But that's not immediate. That might be another 2 or 3 years off. But I think as people are understanding what it takes to look after rhinos, and there's more and more funding that will support it, and more and more parks in Africa are recovering. The group that's spearheading that whole process is African Parks Network. They've put rhinos into Malawi, to Rwanda. They're going to put some into Garamba National Park in DRC, and they've put black rhinos into Chad as well. So they've spearheaded this recolonization of rhinos back into their historical range very successfully.
Mm. Can you tell us a little bit about what your current roles are and what organizations you're working with? Because I feel like you're involved in quite a bit. Maybe just give us a little brief overview of what you're up to.
So I wear a number of hats. I'm a veterinarian by training, and I spent a large part of my career running the Veterinary Wildlife Services Department for South African National Parks, and that's where I got a significant amount of rhino experience. Before that, I was with a provincial park system called the Northwest Parks and Tourism Board, and they had a number of reserves that we reintroduced rhinos into, and I did a lot of rhino work there as well. Subsequent to that, I went to Botswana to facilitate the big rhino recovery project called the Rhinos Without Borders project, which unfortunately has only been partially successful because there was a bit of a lack of proper investment to protect those rhinos. So they did breed up very well and did very well in the Okavango Delta, but then poachers from Zambia and through internal leaks poached most of them out in the last 2 or 3 years. There's a small population left in the Delta that's doing well, and elsewhere in Botswana. But unfortunately, that's a story you don't really want to repeat, because it was the third time that rhinos have more or less gone extinct in the Delta, which is very unfortunate. And then from there, I joined the Oak Foundation. It's a family foundation that supports conservation initiatives, and they seed funded the Rhino Recovery Fund with the Wildlife Conservation Network. And for various reasons, I was asked to oversee that because I've got so much rhino experience, and that's sort of where I split my time between. And then I've got an advisory role within the Indonesian rhino recovery of Sumatran rhinos, which is under the sort of oversight of the International Rhino Foundation. So I'm very involved with things rhino, basically everywhere I work. And then obviously doing conservation support where there are no rhinos as well, but a conservationist at heart, and with a strong focus on rhino conservation, because it is a proxy, as I explained to you. If you can get rhino conservation right, then many other things are going to fall in place as well.
Yeah, I think that's always a good point when people are questioning, why rhinos. I mean, it's having one of these iconic species that you're protecting. Just, the kind of secondhand effects are protecting all these other species in that area and the land and the habitat.
They create a bit of a safety net and a blanket over the landscape, which hopefully can change in the future, because there's some inherent conflict in that, because it means you've got rhino, you've got armed rangers, and politically and socially there's a pushback against that, particularly in Africa. But at the end of the day, if you have to protect yourself against armed and very aggressive wildlife criminals, you can't expect the rangers not to be armed and trained to be combat ready, if you want to call it like that. But you also need to find a way to have your best defenses through communities that live in and around the parks. And that's not a simple thing. There are various levels of involvement that they often have, or various levels of development. And it takes a long time to gain their trust. It takes a long time to work with them. So I think the road ahead is going to change, but we have to work within changing environments to constantly adapt, so that ecosystem health actually ends up being the winner for everybody, because without that, we're not going to survive as a species in the long term in any case.
There's a lot I want to dive into still, but can we go back to, where did you grow up? How did you initially get connected to conservation, to wildlife, to wanting to be involved in this field?
Well, I'm very blessed to have had parents that were incredibly outdoor focused. Neither of them worked in the outdoor environment, but we spent a lot of time on weekends and our holidays hiking and going to game reserves, and both of them had a very keen interest in natural history. So I got exposed to my grandfather on my mother's side as well. So I got exposed to nature and nature-based things from a very young age. And then I just remained interested. And then at the age of 14, I actually decided that I wanted to work in the conservation arena. And from then onwards, everything I did in my holidays and weekends was sort of geared towards it. I started doing a lot of bird ringing, started volunteering in game reserves. I volunteered with wildlife vets, and then I got into veterinary science. And that was really just with the aim of becoming a wildlife veterinarian. And I was very blessed that I could actually enter that arena quite quickly after I qualified, and then it just grew from there.
Can you put into words what attracts you to working outside, working around wildlife? Like what energy does that give you? What connection? I mean, why are you so drawn to this?
I think once the wild bug bites you, it's sort of something that sticks with you forever. I mean, if you enjoy hiking and if you enjoy outdoors, if you enjoy anything natural, then and you have an interest in it, I think you just, you're fueled by the need to get more and more knowledge and be making a difference. And I believe that if you can leave a little bit of a footprint on this planet that's good for the future generations, that's something that you can go to sleep with very well and wake up with a smile in your morning. It's not easy. I can tell you that. The more I'm involved with this field, the more I realize how we've really destroyed this planet, and how business and money and greed completely is against any real long-term sustainable solution. So, you do get despondent at times, but I think if I look back at my career, and I've been very, very privileged to do what I did, lots of animals are in areas now where they weren't before, because the teams that I've worked with and I've led have put those animals back there. We've worked, plan and recover reserves that were completely denuded, made new reserves, funding people now that are doing incredibly good conservation work. So I think it's sort of like a bit of a passion and like a religion. Once you believe in it, you really want to see it through. And I really want my children and my grandchildren to one day be able to still experience the wild and see the wildlife that I've been privileged to see. And I've been very privileged to work with virtually all the African large mammals that you possibly can work with, have my hands on them, touch them, catch them, move them. And that's incredibly satisfying. And, I don't for 1 minute, sort of take it for granted. It's an absolute privilege to have had those experiences, and still hoping to have many more going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk about some of those early days out in the field as a veterinarian, and what were some of the most memorable? I mean, working with the wildlife. Where did you kind of start out, and what were some of those experiences that really kept you fueled?
So when I was a student as a veterinarian, I actually irritated and harassed all the very few wildlife vets that were active in South Africa. There weren't that many at the time. And whenever I got a free moment, I would try and join them for capture operations. And it was just so incredibly exciting. And then I sort of got a job with the university through a company that did both wildlife and exotic species. So I did most of the exotic species and a little bit of the wildlife stuff. And then my real break came when I was employed as a field ecologist in a newly proclaimed game reserve called Madikwe Game Reserve. And it was still to this date one of the most ambitious reintroductions ever undertaken. It was called Operation Phoenix. And I sort of joined it through the middle of the operation. And when all the specialized species had to be reintroduced, I was in charge of sourcing, catching, and bringing in all the predators, black rhino, elephants already been brought in, but as a student, I was involved with that. All the antelope species. So I very quickly gained a huge amount of experience. And I remember, the first day I arrived in the reserve, just thinking, geez, I can't believe that this is actually my life now, that I can actually go and work with wildlife. I would work from daybreak until late at night, getting food for the lions that we were reintroducing, or the hyenas or the leopards or the cheetahs, and then following them and having to find them, darting them, putting collars on, and in later years catching them for translocation elsewhere. And as a young veterinarian, you just can't ask for anything more exciting and more exhilarating than that. I'd be sometimes catching lions on my own, calling them, darting them, putting collars on, and just looking around thinking, geez, imagine what the rest of the world's doing now.
Yeah, it sounds pretty incredible. I mean, can you walk us through, I'm sure it's quite different maybe for different species, but what's, capturing, and maybe we could just use rhinos since that's, one of our main focuses, but capturing and translocating a rhino, what are some of the challenges? What do people probably not realize goes into this? I mean, it's a really big creature you're first trying to catch and then move to a new location and then make sure it can take to that new habitat and continue on as a healthy rhino. So I don't know if you can walk us through what that process is like from your point of view.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that there are 5 rhino species and all of them are vastly different, not so much physiologically, but certainly in the way they respond to drugs. So pharmacologically, they differ. They differ in the way they behave. They differ in the way you're able to do the logistics. So I'll start maybe with white rhino because they've probably been the most translocated of all the rhino species. At one stage in South Africa, there were probably 1,000 rhinos being moved a year, which doesn't really happen anywhere else, even on the continent. So there's been a huge amount of experience gained with that. And I think, firstly, you need to understand that they are highly successfully, very powerful animals. So you need to be able to manage them without hurting the rhino because they've got so much power. And secondly, that you don't end up destroying your equipment or damage your staff or the team that's working with them. So the preferred method nowadays is to use a potent opioid in a dart. They are very susceptible to the negative side effects, so you need to understand that. So you need to manage those side effects with a different type of opioid reversal drug, partial reversal drug, and then if you get that all right, then the risk run becomes much less and end up losing or potentially losing the rhino to the pharmacology effects of the drug. You then have to have a very robust crate that you can put the rhino in. So rhinos are generally transported individually, not in groups. But before you do all of this, you obviously need to have a reason why you catch it. You need to have a reason where you're taking it to it. You need to make sure wherever you're taking it to it hasn't got the same reasons or same conditions why they eventually disappeared. So it needs to be safe. All of these things need to be in place. There's a lot of background stuff that have to happen. You have to have the right permits in place. You have to have the right vehicles to transport them, the right tranquilizing drugs. And, the capture teams in South Africa, fortunately, have become quite proficient at that, and we in SANParks in the 1 year moved almost 300 rhinos from the Kruger National Park to private and other public reserves. And I know some of the private operators that really ramped up their work with rhinos when it was commercially viable. They would move 500 rhinos in a year. The translocation to Rwanda was a unique experience where 30 rhinos were caught in one morning out of small little camps, loaded into a Boeing by a company called Conservation Solutions, who've got very extensive experience now moving animals internationally. Flown in with a Boeing to Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, offloaded and And 36 hours later, they're all in their camps in Rwanda. I mean, that's an achievement that 50 or even 10 years ago, people thought you're mad if you want to do that. So it's possible. Good capture technique, right drugs, right equipment to keep them in so they don't damage themselves, and then tranquilizing them adequately during the transport so that they don't fight the crate, because they can really hurt themselves. So that's white rhino. Black rhino are a little bit more complex because they're more aggressive. They tend to be a lot more feisty in the crates. So your crates need to be designed that they don't get stuck or they can't get a horn into any nook and cranny. And you do need to tranquilize them much more aggressively than you do white rhinos. And unlike white rhino, you want to actually put as many black rhino into their new habitats as possible at the same time, because if you trickle feed like you can with white rhinos or the greater one-horn rhino, you end up having mortalities unnecessarily because the established rhinos often will fight with the new rhinos that come into the area. So it's understanding these biological and behavioral nuances between the species is extremely important. So the greater one-horn in India and Nepal are more similar to white rhinos than to the black rhinos in Africa. And they've also been translocated at much lower numbers, but there has been some translocation, and they seem to adapt just as well as white rhinos with these like staggered introductions, which you can't do with a black rhino as easily. You can, but I mean, the risk runs much higher. And then obviously your two jungle-based species, the Sumatran and the Javan, are almost impossible to catch. There have been some caught historically for zoos, and the Javan rhino, I don't know when the last Javan rhino was caught actually. It must have been in the early 1900s that they try to keep them in zoos, but not successfully. Sumatran rhinos, there was a big push to catch Sumatran rhinos that were being isolated in patches of forest that were being felled for palm oil production. And I think about 40 rhinos were captured, and they catch them with pit traps. So you then have to dig a trap on a path that the rhino uses regularly and hope that it falls in there, and that you need to then check it every day. Much more drawn out, long-term process, much more risk because, obviously the rhino can hurt itself. And then once it's caught, you have to get it into a temporary holding facility and then load it into a truck and try and get it out of the jungle. And all of these things take time. So sometimes it takes between a month to a year before the rhino actually falls in the trap once you've set it. What has happened now in more recent times, the only rhinos that are still left are in almost inaccessible mountainous terrain. So trying to use that technique, the risks have just significantly increased because you now have rhinos that are in mountainous terrain where you may be able to set a trap, but once you've caught it in the trap, how the hell do you get it out of the forest to an area where you can transport it? So what has happened in Africa is that the use of helicopters to recover rhinos out of remote areas has been used very successfully now, probably for about 400 rhino recoveries. In April last year, I was privileged enough to lead an operation to recover a rhino that had moved 230 kilometers away from the sanctuary that it was in, and we flew it 230 kilometers, the longest the rhino has ever been flown, hanging by its feet, under anesthesia, with 2 fuel stop landings and checking that the rhino is okay. So it's possible. We've now shown that it's really possible. And one of the reasons I went to Indonesia in December was to discuss with our Indonesian colleagues of using that technique of recovering a captured rhino out of the forest. And we all agreed that probably that's the most reliable way of doing it, not necessarily by slinging it by its feet, but putting it in a crate and then slinging the crate out, rather than taking 5 days to push it out of the forest, which is going to be detrimental to the rhino in any case. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an overview of the difficulty with which it is to capture and move rhinos. It has been, in a way, perfected in southern Africa and to some degree in Kenya. And now the international movement of rhinos in Africa has really picked up speed, flying them into areas where they were before and just reducing the transport time, which is really important for their health, but it can be done.
Can you talk a bit more about the Sumatran rhinos? Maybe what, I think most people are more familiar with the white and the black rhinos of Africa, but can you give us a little bit of a description of, what they're like as an animal, and then also what are the challenges of creating a breeding population? Because I know I chatted with Barney a little bit about this, but it's been quite a while, so maybe you can go into a little bit of detail there.
Yeah, so the Sumatran rhino used to occur throughout Southeast Asia. They went extinct on the mainland about 10 years ago already, and then there was a small remnant captive population on the Sabah section of Borneo, which belonged to Malaysia. The last female died about 2 years ago in that facility, and there are still one in captivity and 1 or 2 that are wild on the Kalimantan side of the Borneo Island. Interestingly enough, those rhinos also appear to be much smaller than the Sumatran and mainland subspecies. So again, rescuing those last remaining few is precariously difficult because you may not be able to breed them with the bigger specimens from Sumatra. But they've got one in captivity, which doesn't really help from a recovery point of view because it needs a partner to breed. And there is another one potentially for capture. And then the only ones that are left are on the island, outside of Borneo, on the island of Sumatra. There's a few left in Waikambas National Park, and that's also where the Sumatra Rhino Sanctuary is, which is being primarily sponsored by the International Rhino Foundation. And there's an NGO called Yabi, which is the name for rhino in Padak is the name for rhino in Indonesia, and Yabi is the Rhino Protection Unit. They run the whole facility, and there are 8 rhinos there at the moment. Those are the only 8 captive rhinos left in the world, apart from the one in Kalimantan. And they've recently had a calf, and potentially going to have more calves now with females that have fallen pregnant. But it's taken a very long time to get to the point where Sumatran rhinos' breeding behavior is properly understood. These rhinos in that facility is a bit of a glimmer of hope for the species. But again, you've only got 8 individuals, of which only 2 females are potentially breeding and 2 males are potentially breeding. So it's a very small genetic pool to work from. So the idea is now to catch straggler rhinos that are left in pockets of forest and add them to this so that the genetic diversity increases. But again, the capture of those rhinos, because of the remote and mountainous locations, is not that easy. So that's the one small population, and the other population that's left is in the Loiza ecosystem, which gives me the greatest hope, because the forest system is more than 20,000 square kilometers, potentially more, and there may be as many as 40 rhinos left in that forest, in that specific location where they've got connectivity with each other. And then there are individuals that they know of that are isolated because of valleys and roads, and there may be some attempt to target those for capture and then bring them to a similar facility to what's in Waikambas, or take them to the Waikambas facility. So the Sumatran rhino is the only 2-horned rhino in Asia. The Javan and the greater one-horned only have 1 horn. And the big difference between the Javan and the greater one-horn is that the females Javan rhinos don't have horns, and the males have slightly bigger plates. But they're not that easy to distinguish if you just saw a photo of the 2 species next to each other. They are, mutually exclusive from a habitat point of view, because the Javan are jungle species, whereas the greater one-horned are in the Brahmaputra River system on floodplains and eat grass mainly, long sort of tropical grass, whereas the 2 jungle species browse. And that makes them very difficult to keep in captive conditions because they've got such a selective diet. And there was attempts to keep them in zoos. Then the last remaining ones were in the Cincinnati Zoo. They were returned to the Sumatra Rhino Sanctuary some years back, and the males that came back are actually the ones now breeding with the 2 fertile females. So you can see how precarious the situation is there, and the key for survival of both the Javan and the Sumatran rhino is to protect those forests that they're still in, and to slowly sort of expand the safe area that as the population grows, that they've got areas to move into, and that's potentially possible with the Loiza system with the Sumatran rhino, but it's very difficult with the Javan rhino because already they're reaching some level of capacity with the area they're in, and there's very limited opportunity for expansion. So there may need to be an attempt to capture and move some to a new park, which is going to be challenging because of the jungle environment that they're in.
Yeah, I was going to ask as you were talking about it, is there enough habitat for them left, even if you bring the populations back to viable size? And is that a big part of this, is making sure to protect that and expand that?
Yeah, so certainly with the Sumatran rhino, if that Loiza ecosystem can be protected, and even areas of utilization forest, as they're called, they can be reclaimed and left to regrow as wild forest, then there's definitely a lot of habitat, and potentially the population could grow to a couple of hundred or even 1,000 if allowed to do so in the safe habitat. It's just also very difficult to patrol those areas because it's truly rainforest in high mountains. And I mean, the amount of people they've got to patrol and manage these areas is small. So it's very easy to do a crime there and get away with it. So your intelligence systems need to be really in place, and you need to have significant public and civil society will to work with you so that they can actually help sort of give information that there are people in the area that are looking for rhino horn or whatever. But, the situation is very precarious. I was actually shocked at how difficult it was to do any work in that environment because of the terrain and the forests and the high mountains. I mean, the rangers there that do the rhino patrols typically can move maybe 1 kilometer in an hour because they have to chop themselves through the forest and climb on these steep hills. And reaching an area of patrol 10 k's away will take a whole day or 2 days to get to. And I mean, that's just not a task that anybody can do.
Yeah, it's hard to even visualize how dense and tough that kind of terrain could be. What are some of the things you're looking forward to in the near future with Rhino Recovery Fund and a lot of the different projects you're doing? Anything that really stands out?
I think that the projects that really excite me the most is those where potentially new population is going to be reintroduced, which is there's some plans to do so through the African Parks Network into Matusha Donna National Park in Zimbabwe, and maybe not this year, but soon. They're also running a park in Angola called Iona, which is potentially a recipient for desert rhinos that occur in Namibia, to work more with the Namibians to really secure and expand their population because they've really done a good job at protecting their rhinos. And yeah, hopefully there's a big meeting on Asian rhinos coming up in February, which I'm hoping to attend. That should give me a very good overview of what's really happening, and then working with them to find solutions to expand rhinos in Asia as well. Yeah, so the most exciting aspect that I look forward to, and that's where I've really done a lot of work, is reintroducing them into areas where they formerly went extinct, and then seeing them establish and grow and eventually becoming part of the system again.
Yeah, I know you mentioned a little bit of this, but what keeps you going? What gets you up in the morning to keep doing this work, facing all the challenges, and especially talking about like the Sumatran and Javan rhinos? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of moments where you could be like, is this even worth all the effort? But what keeps you motivated to keep pushing on?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because like after the trip to Indonesia, I was fairly despondent about how difficult it is to do stuff like that. But I was also incredibly encouraged and energized by the local NGO called Forum Conservatie Loisa, which is a short name for it is FKL. How dedicated their people are to actually do this work and actually try and turn the tide around and influence people and working with communities and patrolling the forest and then having a smile on their face and joking and being energetic about doing this incredibly difficult job. Being able to support people like that gives me a lot of energy. And then also to just recognize that we as people have to make the decision to protect these species. We need to decide as a species ourselves that we want to save another species because that's within our power. And working with other conservationists and working within the Wildlife Conservation Network, the Oak Foundation, where that's a fundamental sort of foundation of what we're doing. It's very energizing to work with people like that because you're not completely alone. And I think the tide is turning, that there's a general recognition that we can't continue down this incredible extractive path and think that there's going to be no consequences. I mean, there's just been published that 2022 was the hottest year on record from when temperatures were being recorded. I mean, that has to tell you something, that we're not living in a bubble anymore. We're literally living in a space where if we don't really start changing our own behavior, we as a species are going to be threatened with our own survival. And using rhinos as a focus point, if we can get rhino protection right, so many other things will definitely be in place because you have to make sure security is good. People have acceptance of the species, that there's good law enforcement, there's good application of the laws. You've got an area that is wild. All of these things need to work together towards a point where they will then breed safely and expand. So just as a single point of success, if you can successfully protect rhinos, you're protecting a whole lot of other stuff and to the benefit of the people living in and around that area.
Yeah. Can you give any advice to someone that might be starting out in a path of conservation or becoming a veterinarian, or, what would you tell them going into this that you've learned over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I think I can speak for hours on this, but I think some of the basic lessons which I think are worth keeping in the back of your mind is, one, conservation is actually about working with people, not with animals only. And if you don't want to work with people, don't become a conservationist, because there are so many people out there, there's so many communities, and if you don't know how to work or interact with them, you're going to end up frustrating yourself. Number two is that only effective teams can really change things and work well together. As an individual, you can do so much, but you can never achieve the same amount as working with an effective team. And being an effective team member means that you don't always take the credit or try and promote yourself above anybody else, because you're only one cog in the wheel. And then, just to have determination and patience, because when you start off, that's certainly the experience I had, you get a lot of resistance, unfortunately, often from the very people you think are your supporters, like the other conservationists, because it is a small world, it is territorial, and people do get a bit possessive about their little turf. And again, that's part of the conservation conundrum that we're sitting in. We need to break through that and work as a collective community to save this planet. And that can only be done if we know how to work with other people, and we put our own ego and our own ambition sort of slightly below the outcome of the greater cause. That's sort of just a few words of what I've learned in the few years that I've done this now.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's so much people work is such a huge part of it, because most of the times people are the problem and the solution. So we need to work together. And same with egos too. It's funny how people can get really protective about their special little, niche within the conservation community. And sometimes that ends up, instead of working together and having that power, compounding power of a team, sometimes we fight each other. So I think it's really good advice that we need to kind of let that go and find ways to work together and amplify each other within the conservation space. Do you have, as kind of a final question, do you have any questions that you wish people would ask you that it seems like, when you're having a conversation maybe with someone that's not as connected to the space, is there something that you wish they would ask you?
I think a good question to ask is that, I think people often equate wildlife to pets, or the way you manage pets, and have very emotional connotations of wanting to see everything almost like a Disney perfect world where everything works harmoniously well together. That's unfortunately not how the real work was. So I think a question that's worth asking is to say, what are the operational challenges in the areas where these people have to work? What are those realities? Is it, because I think people come with a very preconceived set of idealisms and ideas and often try and impose them on areas where they think, this is how wildlife should be protected, or this is how people should behave. But like going to Indonesia, for example, working with those teams, you realize how socially delicate their work is. The minute they start pushing too hard for law enforcement, the community is just completely rebelling against them and often do the opposite to what they want to achieve. Being a foreigner in that environment, you've got no right to tell them anything what to do, because you don't understand how those things work. So I think ask the question, what are the real operational challenges of doing something correctly? And maybe idealism is a healthy emotion to have, because I think it helps change things for the better, but it's not something you want to impose or force, because often it has the opposite effect. And I think the conservation space at the moment is very, very delicate, with the strong north-south tension, where people in the south still have a lot of wildlife, Africa, South America, to some degree Australia, and maybe a little bit in Southeast Asia. And then you've got the money in the UK, in Europe, in North America, and very strong agendas and sort of idealism trying to dictate how things should be done. I think we just need to balance that and make sure that we always make sure we support the pragmatic solution that has some local relevance, because if it hasn't, then people will not implement it.
Yeah, I think that's really wise, especially, when you're entering a new space or areas, do more listening than talking. You've got to listen and learn first before you can actually apply yourself or your money in a way that actually has positive impact. So, yeah, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got so many things going on, and it sounds like a lot of travel coming up. Is there anything that you're super excited about in the travel space before I let you go?
Yeah, I'm going to Nepal, hopefully in February, to attend the Asian Rhino Specialist Group. I'm going to Chitwan National Park, where they've got the greater one-horned rhinos, one of the big success stories of recovering rhinos there. I've never been to Nepal. And yeah, I'm hoping to go back to Kenya sometime this year, because there's, it's one of the countries with massively successful rhino recovery projects and also other conservation outcomes. And yeah, then there are potentially some trips to the more remote areas of Africa where there are plans to put rhinos back, and just being in wild spaces and seeing the potential optimism of recovering rhinos where they've gone extinct.
Yeah, it sounds like an exciting year ahead. And yeah, Nepal is one of my favorite places. I've been to the World Ranger Congress there in 2019 before all this pandemic stuff started. And yeah, such a beautiful place. And those one-horned rhinos are pretty amazing creatures as well. So yeah, thanks again, Markus. Really appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, hopefully we get to have another chat at some point in the future.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing me on your show.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.